Hello, welcome to this week's episode of Doctor Who Literature. This episode is being released on the Sunday after United States Election Day, 2024. I was hoping for a different tenor to the beginning of this episode. Instead, we'll begin with a snippet from one of my favorite protest songs, and then we'll jump right into my interview with Mark and Conrad from Trap 1 and Big Finish respectively about this week's book, the novelization of The Ultimate Foe, but the next voice you hear will be Pete Seeger.
John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. But his soul goes marching on.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
I have two guests to join me to discuss Trial of a Time Lord. Gentlemen, please introduce yourself in alphabetical order, starting with Mark.
Hello, I'm Mark from the Trap 1 podcast, and may I say I'm enraptured to be part of this august enclave.
And I'm Conrad, also sometime of Trap 1, and I'm here corporeally enjoying myself enormously.
So, we are here today to, in true Doctor Who fashion, wrap up our Trial of a Time Lord mini-season, even though this is only episode 3 out of 4 of that mini-season, because the Trial of a Time Lord books were released out of order. So the final Trial of a Time Lord book comes out quite some time before the novelization of the second of 4 Trial of a Time Lord installments. So today we are talking about The Ultimate Foe, which is written by Robert Holmes and uncredited to Eric Sayward and Pip and Jane Baker. There are multiple drafts of Trial of a Time Lord episode 13 and Trial of a Time Lord episode 14 available on the season 23 Blu-ray collection box set. And I'm just curious, gentlemen, have you read the original Robert Holmes script, only half of which made it to camera, for episode 13, and have you read the original Eric Sayward script for episode 14, which led to significant litigation and did not see the light of day until the Blu-rays came out almost 40 years later?
I have never read them, but I have heard them acted out on the Flight Through Entirety podcast a few years ago, but I can't remember very much about it.
Yeah, I haven't read them either, I'm afraid.
I did not know there was a dramatic reading of those. That's interesting.
Have you, Jason?
Yes, because when the Blu-rays came out, I saved them for the appropriate part of my pilgrimage. So when I reached trial in my Twitter pilgrimage in late 2021, I wanted to have a frame of reference. The most interesting part of episode 13 is Robert Holmes wrote an entire 25-minute script. Half of it takes place in the trial scenes. Half of it takes place in the Matrix. He then dies, and the episode ends up airing quite some time after he passes away. Eric Sayward really did not change a word of the trial scenes, but he entirely rewrote the Matrix scenes. So when you watch the Matrix scenes in episode 13, not one word of that is Robert Holmes. That is all Eric Sayward, writing uncredited. I suspect the reason why he did this, and it may have been for budgeting, it may have been because of sets, I have no idea, but my suspicion is one of the characters that the Doctor meets in the Matrix delivers a line of dialogue that manages to combine two ethnic slurs in the same sentence. One against people of Italian descent and one against people of Chinese descent. So as far as Robert Holmes is concerned, he was writing Talons of Wang Chiang Part 7. Eric Sayward, to his credit, and I very rarely credit Eric Sayward for anything on this podcast, but he removed a double-barreled ethnic slur from Robert Holmes' script, which is preserved on the Blu-rays. If you read the actual Robert Holmes draft for 13, you can see what might have been, and we're very glad did not come to be.
So is that on the Blu-ray drive? Is it a BD drive that you need to read those?
Yes.
I still need to get one of those because I know there's a lot of material I've not been able to access yet.
I cannot recommend those enough because they give you often 2 or 3 scripts for every story on the Blu-ray. So if you guys had a chance to hear my Space Museum episode on Doctor Who literature, I went through both versions of the script. So you can see exactly what Glyn Jones put in, and you can see exactly what Dennis Spooner took out. So just to give an example of a script that reportedly was changed quite a bit in order to make it to screen. It's the same for Dalek Invasion of Earth. When we covered Season 2 on Trap 1, the Season 2 Blu-rays, I had Simon do a live dramatic reading of the scripted speech that William Hartnell was supposed to give to say goodbye to Susan in Episode 6 of Dalek Invasion of Earth. The scripted lines only bear a passing resemblance to what William Hartnell puts out on camera. I think Hartnell's version is the better one, but you can listen to that episode of Trap 1 and see how Cy performs the lines that William Hartnell was supposed to say.
Mm.
And eventually we will get the scripts for Celestial Toymaker, which are a palimpsest of different drafts and different ideas. There is a legend that the names George and Margaret actually appear in the surviving camera scripts for Celestial Toymaker. It was one bit they forgot to paste over. So the old scripts are fascinating and in many ways more interesting than just a mere transcript of the episode as televised. And that goes doubly so for Trial of a Time Lord, because now you can see what Robert Holmes wrote and you can see what Eric Sayward wrote. I only read episode 14, the Sayward draft, once. I don't think it's very good. I think the Pip and Jane Baker version is much better. And I think ending episode 14 on a cliffhanger after a season-long adventure would have been a horrible idea. So even though Robert Holmes wanted to do it, I think we're really lucky that it didn't happen. As much as Ultimate Foe and Trial of a Time Lord may be derided in fandom, I think it would have been so much worse if after all that, the season ends on a cliffhanger.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that would have been tough. Speaking of the Blu-ray extras, first of all, I have to shout out to Paul Scoons, who you had on the other week, who wrote a lot of the production notes, which I always like to watch along. Paul Scoons, I'm right, aren't I?
Yes.
Yes, good. So I thoroughly enjoy the production notes. I don't tend to dig into the scripts, but I always read the production notes with a commentary while watching at the same time. I like a multi-sensory experience. Just put all the information in my mind. But I thoroughly enjoy his production notes on that. But there is one thing that is on the Blu-ray thing that I have in real life. It's a piece of Ultimate Foe ephemera because I'm incapable of going on any podcast without bringing a piece of merchandise on. And I've got a piece of Ultimate Foe merchandise. And dear gentle listener, I'm just going to have to describe this to you. So this was the Zigzag poster. Zigzag being a TV show, and this is about the making of a television program. So it was an educational program going behind the scenes on how you made TV shows. And they produced this free poster you could send off for, which is all about the making of the Ultimate Foe. So there are scripts, there are studio layouts, there's sort of pictures of Bonnie Langford in makeup chairs, there's all kinds of interesting stuff, which is also on the Blu-ray as well. But I just happened to, I thought, I'm sure I've got this, and I found it, and it's signed by dear Colin Baker. So that's a piece of Ultimate Foe specific merchandise that you can find on your Blu-ray PDFs.
That's awesome.
So, Conrad, when would you have first seen Ultimate Foe? Were you, am I correct in assuming, watching in December 1986 when these two stories first went out?
Very much so. I was 15 years old. The Colin Baker era, season 22, and I remember it sort of reactivated I think something in my age. I just thought, I'm now back into being a Doctor Who fan. It was really my second wave of being a Doctor Who fan. I adored Colin Baker. I still do. And the trial season was the first season, crucially, where we had a VHS, which, as every fan knows, the first time you can record Doctor Who and rewatch it just changes your experience of it completely. So I know Trial of the Time Lord absolutely word perfect Inside Out, the whole lot. I've watched them a million times. I bloody love The Trial of a Time Lord, all of it. I think Vervoids is probably my favourite. Yes, I watched it at Ultimate Foe at the time. I think I preferred part 1 to part 13 to part 14, but that's fairly reasonable considering the shopping list that the whole series had to wrap up, but that particularly Pip and Jane having to write it with not being allowed to see the Saywood script. So yeah, I saw it at the time, absolutely loved it, and I regularly used to write to the people in it. So I certainly wrote to Colin. I wrote to Pip and Jane quite a few times and had lovely letters back. I wrote it's mainly for autographs. I wrote to Michael Jaston, Linda Bellingham, who wrote back from with headed paper from a hotel in Barbados. So the Inquisitor I like to think of the Inquisitor on holiday with her full headgear, drinking a cocktail, writing a fan mail. So I was fully invested in Trial of a Time Lord. I loved it then, and so of course I still love it now. So that was me.
What were your initial reactions in December 1986? And this is going to be a multi-part question, because in December 1986, did you know that Colin Baker was not coming back? Was that known to fandom at the time? Also, did you have any inkling of how the story was going to end? And lastly, did you enjoy it, or were you more in the manner of Chris Chibnall going on Junior Points of View, carrying the complaints of the Liverpool fan club, saying this is rubbish? Where were you at with all that?
I think the rumours of Colin, of leaving, which I think I'm right in saying was around the end of Mind Warp, beginning of Vervoids. I think that like the tabloids were often stirring it, but you often never knew what was quite real and quite wasn't. So I think I was aware there was trouble at Mill, but I'm not sure there'd been an official announcement or anything. In terms of knowing how the trial would wrap up, absolutely no idea. And really, the revelation about there was still that revelation about the Time Lords had been, helping sleepers, get secrets. Like none of that made any sense. It still doesn't make sense today. But the revelation about the Valiard was one of the biggest, maybe it was the first real sort of continuity punch in the stomach reveal, mind-blowing things and that I ever experienced. And I watch it now and it's so well done and the music's so good, it still physically gives me chills. Like I watched these episodes a couple of times over the last week, and every time they make that revelation saying, wait a minute, did you call him the Doctor? I just get chills down my side of my face. So yeah, I didn't know that, and absolutely no. I remember watching that open air thing, and I just felt really. I was on Doctor Who's side, the production side completely. I was on Pip and Jane's side completely. So I was very much not that. I was 15, so probably wasn't as old as those boys. So maybe I wasn't quite as jaded. So no, I totally I had my reservations, but overall I was fully invested and I loved it.
I have been looking at Broad DW Cast, that I believe is the John Predel website that details what stations around the world aired Doctor Who and when they aired it. I used to have an encyclopedic memory of when I saw every Doctor Who story, because I had access to many PBS stations in the mid-'80s, all of which were showing Doctor Who at different points in time. So within my first 12 months of fandom, I was able to watch Doctor Who on Long Island, PBS, New York City PBS, New Jersey PBS, Scranton, Pennsylvania's PBS, Boston's PBS, etc. So I saw the first 6 Doctors all between November 1984 and November 1985. I don't recall exactly when Trial of a Time Lord first screened, and Broad WCast does not say. However, it does say that season 24 aired in the autumn of 1989. My recollection is that Trial of a Time Lord would have first screened for me in September 1988. I know it was the Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah, because I know we had a lot of families staying over at our house for the holidays, and my younger cousins were watching Mysterious Planet with me, and I was sitting there enthralled because it was a much different Colin Baker than I was used to. to my mind, it was much fresher and more enjoyable than season 22. And I was writing down the cliffhangers on a scrap of paper, and my cousins were like, "What are you doing?" I'm pretty sure that would have been 1988, because in 1987 we did the Jewish holidays somewhere else that was not our home. So if season 23 airs in 88, it stands to reason that season 24 airs a year later in 1989. So September 88 is my best guess as to when I first would have seen this. That's 2 years after you. So in other words, I would have had this novelization, the Ultimate Foe novelization, before I saw Trial of a Time Lord on TV. And I know for a fact the way that I learned about Perry's death was when I got the Terror of the Vervoids novelization, because that was the first Trial of a Time Lord book to come out. So I knew about Perry's death long before I found out that she survived, and long before I would have seen the corresponding episodes on television. I don't remember much about sitting there. It would have been probably October 88. I would have been 15 at that time too, watching Ultimate Foe. I don't remember if I liked it. I don't remember if I didn't like it. I remember the cliffhanger to episode 13, but I don't remember much else about it. I already knew about the Master because I'd seen the novelization, so I was spoiled in every regard. I just don't remember if I liked it or if I disliked it, or if it was just Doctor Who, and I loved all Doctor Who equally, and I had no critical opinion. So it's not one of the stories that I have more vivid memories of. And for me now, the behind-the-scenes stuff, which I've talked about earlier, the Robert Holmes draft, half of which got junked, the Eric Sayward draft, all of which got junked, I find the behind-the-scenes much more interesting than the story itself. Later on in the program, in the audio essay, I'm going to go into my problems with the production, specifically Chris Clough's direction, which I think actively harms the story in many respects. I'll go into that later. You guys will hear it on Sunday. But let me turn over to Mark. What was the first time, if I'm correct, Mark, you weren't even a Doctor Who fan when this aired in 1986. So you would have seen this much later.
Yeah, I didn't see it until it was released on video when it came out in the TARDIS tin, the really exciting packaging, which I think was 1993, if I'm right. It was the anniversary year, so I got it for Christmas in 1993.
Oh, get in!
And I remember that I'd because you could get the tins with all of the first seven Doctors. As in, you picked a tin up and it had a Doctor out of the first seven Doctors on the bottom. And I remember I specifically asked for the sixth Doctor because I wanted the Doctor that the story pertained to. So yeah, I asked for it for Christmas and then specified it had to have Colin Baker on the bottom as well, which was just...
And did it?
We did, yeah. But it must have been a pain for my mum, I suppose, to
love that. I did
have had to check them.
I did the same. When I went to the shops, I was just going through looking underneath them all. But yeah, I got the Colin one as well. It's a thing of real beauty, that tin.
It's lovely, isn't it? And then so it's on 3 videos inside and in just sort of cardboard cases. But I remember that Christmas, I did find it, I really loved the story and I found it really addictive. I was just any sort of 10 minutes where I could get the family TV and VCR. I would just watch like 5-10 minutes of it. And then, somebody would come in and want to watch something else or whatever. But yeah, I was just that sort of Christmas holidays. I was just, any chance I got, I would watch a bit more of it. And I found it really exciting, and I still broadly really like it, I think. It's funny, every time I watch it, I'm always slightly surprised at the reveal that the Valeyard is the Doctor isn't the cliffhanger. In my mind as well, I think in my mind, the Master delivers it much more dramatically. When he says, or as I've always known him, the Doctor. But it isn't like that. It just goes, as I've always known him, the Doctor. And then it's something for the Doctor then to pick up on and say, oh, hang on a minute, did you say the Doctor? It's always a more grandiose moment in my mind, weirdly, I think.
I love it. It's quite funny in the novelisation, which we'll get onto. Pip and Jane add some stuff into that bit, which I don't know if it helps, because when he says... as I was known him, the Doctor, they have a bit of in theatre terms it's called rhubarb, a bit of chat, but they actually write out the thing. Did he just say call him the Doctor? Was it a Freudian slip? Did I hear that correctly? Blah, blah, blah. And they literally script the extras. That is the depth of their craft.
They've moved it much earlier in the scene, haven't they? So on the TV story, the Valeyard sort of bolts from the courtroom almost immediately after that revelation. Whereas in the book, there's quite a lot of discussion of it before he runs away. A lot of the dialogue that takes place on the TV after he's gone it's also very, very much rearranged, isn't it? Like that, I think, in the book.
Yeah, it's punchier on TV, I think.
See, I would have had the revelation about the Valiard's true identity spoiled for me from the book, so I don't remember how I would have initially reacted to the TV, except that I already knew what was about to happen. And I think the story is less served by the fact that the Valiard never appears again, and the revelation just sort of hangs there. And it has been touched on in various spin-off media, like some of the Craig Hinton novels, and I understand Big Finish may have done some Valiard stuff that I haven't heard. But for me, it's it's an uninteresting revelation, and nothing really happens with it, and it's sort of a loose end that can kind of sort of be airbrushed out of the canon. So the Valiard just doesn't work for me. My biggest problem with Trial of a Time Lord is it doesn't end with a trial. It ends in the Matrix, and the trial turns out to be a sham, and the courtroom just becomes a place for people to shout at each other without any actual legal or dramatic tension. So Witness for the Prosecution or 12 Angry Men, this is not.
This is your legal background coming out, of course.
Even
is this not what happens? I imagined it was lots of objection, overruled. I imagined it was I'm here for the drama.
That's the Al Pacino movie, And Justice for All. You're out of order. No, you're out of order.
Love it.
That is probably the world's worst Al Pacino impression. But again, I am fond of Ultimate Foe, and I am fond of this book. But for me, it doesn't really rank up there in my pantheon in my top 60. I think if there was a different director, and if the production team had bothered to script out the entirety of the story in advance without having these fights at the last minute. Let's see, we've already aired the beginning of the story. How do we end it? I mean, that's just the original sin that they can't get over. They should have had all 14 episodes mapped out before the cameras started rolling on Mysterious Planet. And the fact that they didn't, and the fact that you have such litigation and bitterness resulting from Eric Sayward quitting, and then coming back freelance, and then quitting a second time. Pip and Jane do a great job writing this thing in 48 hours, but it should never have happened that way.
I like. It's amazing to me how I totally agree. They should have sketched out where this is going, so at least everyone has a sense of where they're going. But it still amazes me they don't do this even in sort of big, expensive Hollywood films today. The latest, well, this is again back a few years, the Star Wars trilogy, Force Awakens to Rise of Skywalker, they didn't know where they were going, so each director kind of changed it and whatever. And I was like, how can you spend that much money on something so big and just not get a plot? One thing that Trial of Time Lord also has in common is that Pip and Jane Baker in the book put in the line, somehow the Valiard had escaped, which it's nice to know that those are lines are still, it was good enough for Pip and Jane, it's good enough for George Lucas and co. I adore that.
George Lucas had nothing to do with the sequel trilogy.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
That was all J.J. Abrams. So basically,
overruled. Sorry, objection overruled. Yeah, that's fine.
Episode 7, The Force Awakens, is J.J. Abrams. Objectively, it is a bad movie because all it is retelling Star Wars again. It's Star Wars greatest hits. There was no reason to make that movie, and there was no new story that they were telling. Star Killer Base is a fantastic idea, and it's destroyed at the end of the first movie. It should have been around. We thought the Knights of Ren were going to be important. We thought Supreme Leader Snoke was going to be important. Not important at all. Rian Johnson then shows up. Episode 8 is probably the best movie of that trilogy. Episode 8, I think, is the only movie that didn't require lots of reshoots and did not have a troubled production history. Every other new Star Wars movie, including Rogue One and including Solo, both of which had their original directors fired halfway through. The Last Jedi is the only movie that was actually well made, and it's got some interesting twists and turns. That was so poorly received by the incel fanboys, it ends up costing Colin Trevorrow the chance to write and direct Episode 9, which was the original plan. J.J. Abrams comes back in and says, all right, after all the negative reaction to Episode 8 by the fanboys, I'm going to rewrite Episode 9, and I'll get rid of everything that Episode 8 made fascists sad about. So he undid everything good about Episode 8. So Episode 9 is a reaction to Episode 8, and the somehow Palpatine return line is as unforgivably bad as, why can't you just hold me like you did that time by the lake on Naboo? Or I hate sand. It's itchy and rough and gets everywhere. It's just right down there are some of the worst lines ever spoken in Star Wars. So Ultimate Foe is better than Rise of Skywalker.
It's official. You heard it here first. And the dialogue, there's certainly none of those sort of clunkers. The dialogue isn't. There's nothing so crude in the dialogue here. It is. This dialogue is. It's. What is this dialogue, Mark? How would you describe this dialogue? As a plain speaking man,
verbose,
loquacious.
Now, Conrad called me loquacious on Twitter after I met him over the summer. So shots fired.
I don't know many words. Yeah, Mark, how'd you find this dialogue? Just
again, I have no recollection of the line "catharsis of spurious morality" from the first time that I watched this. It wasn't until I got to Records Doctor Who in the early '90s that I understood that was a bad line. I have no recollection of it from my original viewing. Same with Megabyte Modem.
Well,
no impression on me.
In the book, they spell modem M-O-D-U-M in the book.
There's a couple of typos in this book.
But I didn't know if that was to try and differentiate it from a modem as we would know it. To try and sort of say, it's not the nonsensical megabyte modem. A modem is a space thing that you wouldn't know about or something like that.
Also, spurious is the word gets used twice. What's interesting I find in this book is that because I know Pip, I just have to say I love Pip and Jane's writing and stories. I can't resist it. I find it irresistible. Mark Durrani vervoids this. I just as I went along watching them, they were always my favourite stories, and I still just have immense fondness for them. But so I noticed a few Pip and Jane-isms that they use. So in this one, they refer in the book novelization. They refer to a Judas goat. The word antediluvian appears, both vervoid, good old words. And spurious makes 2 appearances in this book, not only in the catharsis of the spurious morality, but also in this little sentence, which kind of gives you a little key to the whole book. So when they unmask Popplewick as the Valeyard, and he changes his demeanour, they describe it as the officious kowtowing of the spurious clerk had regressed to the conniving prosecutor's abrasive condescension. It took all of my lungs to get that sentence out. And I have to give you my other one. When they were escaping from the feathers, the exploding feathers. Deep breath for this one. Detonating quills strafed the cobblestones in a demonic blitzkrieg, forcing them to hop a zigzag course like demented dervishes. Come on.
Chef's kiss.
Sorry, I just had to dig into some of that. I just wanted the chance to say those words out loud because it's so rich.
Something I want to ask Jason, actually. I know I've heard you a few times on here in Trap One talk about your dislike of fat jokes in modern Doctor Who, and it's definitely something which Pip and Jane Baker pick up on with both the Doctor and with Popplewick. In this book, there's a couple of descriptions of the Doctor. Said his chubby cheeks were flushed with anger, and then once he goes into the Matrix and he's in the waiting room that's the beach, it says, despite his tendency to plumpness, the Doctor raced across the sands. And then with Popplewick's descriptions of his kind of double chins and that kind of thing. They really kind of go to town on the descriptions, I think.
I don't want to say that fat jokes were ever acceptable, but because Colin Baker visibly put on so much weight during the hiatus, even Terrence Dicks makes reference to it in the novelization of The Mysterious Planet, which is the only Colin Baker story that Terrence Dicks ever gets to novelize. It may have been an in-joke at Colin Baker's expense and not an ill-spirited one. With the new series, though, there are fat jokes in everything. There are fat jokes in many, many RTD scripts. There are fat jokes in many Stephen Moffat scripts. And, the 1980s were the decade of insults. It was more socially acceptable to body shame people in the 80s, whereas 20 years on from that, you would have think that we learned our lesson. So I could probably give this stuff in the book a free pass, probably. I think it's much more irksome in the new series.
If I may present a case for the defence, I'm determined to just turn this into a whole courtroom thing, listeners. In Vervoids, I don't know, but it's either the line or the way he plays it, where the Doctor says, I wish I could get rid of my waste as easily, and slaps his stomach, I think is I don't know if that was his line that they wrote into the script. There's something colony in that.
I will tell you, Conrad, if you go back and play my episode on the Terror of the Vervoids novelization,
Yes.
that line does not appear in the Pip and Jane novelization, which I expect is based on their rehearsal scripts. So that would have been a Colin Baker ad lib added in during rehearsal. That's Colin Baker lampooning himself. That would not have been the writers giving him a fat joke to deliver.
Thank you. I would like defense points, whatever you call those in court. Thank you.
One thing I really loved is we learn in this book that the Doctor gives his adventures their names. So he remembers the Mark of the Rani, and it says something like it was an adventure that he dubbed the Mark of the Rani. So
an episode.
Yeah. There. So it's because normally in the target books, or traditionally in the target books, you'd have an asterisk and a footnote that directs you to the specific volume. But in this one, they reveal that the Doctor's given all his adventures names. So I really, really like that.
That was actually one of the things that most impressed me when I was first reading Pip and Jane's books in the 1980s. I love the idea of the Doctor sitting down at the end of every story and giving a title to the adventure. That's a very fan fiction writer's dream right there. Which begs the question what the Hartnell Doctor called Serial A and Serial B and Serial C after they were finished. Did he call them, this is a Doctor Who in 100,000 BC. This is the Tribe of Gum. This is the Mutants. This is Beyond the Sun. This is Inside the Spaceship. Yeah.
And he realized he could save a lot of time by just naming the whole story one thing instead of individual installments as well, didn't he?
And Mark, I have found in the Pip and Jane rehearsal script for part 14, perplexed, the Doctor goes to the alcove into which quote-unquote Popplewick had disappeared. Closer alcove, that's a camera move. An electronic box is clamped to the wall. Multicolored lights blip and a digital display flickers on the instrument panel. Melanie, because they call her Melanie and not Mel. A megabyte modem. But what for? Another angle. Valiard, mocking. Yes, you tell us. Disseminate the news. The Doctor. Disseminate? A particle disseminator! So, modem is how they typed it up in the rehearsal script. So it's either a typo on their port, because a modem was probably more exotic in 1986 than it is now, or maybe they had some new bit of Gallifreyan technology that happened to be called modem. Mm-hmm. I think a typo is more likely the answer on their part. That's why it's called that in the novelization, because that's how it appears in the rehearsal scripts.
Interesting.
You like my Michael Jaston impression?
Love that.
Perfect.
Love that. Can't get enough of that. And also, and what I think, like the scientific stuff, is safe to say, the scientific additions and stuff are probably not Pip and Jane's strong point. I think it's fair to say. But I think what what they may lack in technical expertise. Although even that said, they were very diligent, and I know Pip contacted his brother who worked for CERN or something, some big, scientific place, and tried to get these words like maser and all these kind of things. So I appreciate the effort. They certainly weren't sloppy in the way they did that stuff. But it's the character. I think in the novel, it's the characterization that they really love and relish, because they really do flesh out characters in a life. You hear their thoughts and motivations. Like, I really enjoyed. They made up that the Inquisitor had sort of fought to get this trial to be the pinnacle of her career, to sort of secure her place on a high council. And that's only one line, but that actually really tells you a lot about her and gives you a bit of world building, as well as the Keeper, who, although in the script, I know that the James Bree wasn't happy because his role in the original script was a lot more, and this got hugely cut down. But even with him, they say that he's very worried that if the fact the key has been copied and the Matrix has been breached is his fault, and he worries that might come back on him. Although, to be fair, if you are carrying all of Time Lord consciousness around with you, maybe don't put it in a key on a hook on your chest. But hey, they give everybody these things, the Inquisitor and the Keeper. So they really, I really appreciate the way they flesh out their characters.
I really like the line, I think he's only in the book, when the Inquisitor is talking about how Gallifreyans are uniquely gifted. She says they have no magic, but a Time Lord's perceptions are of the highest order in the universe, and that is why they are subjected to special restraints. These talents should not be fecklessly exploited. I thought it was a really nice description of, the Doctor isn't magic, but he's just got, kind of more abilities and intelligence and perceptions than everyone else. It's a shame that isn't in the TV story, because it's a great line.
Yeah.
James Bree, if you write down a list of your top 5 or your top 10 favorite Doctor Who guest actors, James Bree is very high up on my list. He is very memorable in the War Games, even though he's more of a tertiary or quaternary villain. His line readings in the War Games are memorable, they're easy to imitate, and they're comical but sinister at the same time. Then you come to Full Circle, and he gives a very different human, worried, fretful performance, a million miles removed from his characterization in the War Games. He also had a one line of dialogue in the James Bond movie On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which sounds a little more like him doing his War Games character as opposed to his Full Circle character. I was very excited for him being in Ultimate Foe, but again, it's a nothing part. He's barely there, and it's a kind of disappointing way for him to exit Doctor Who. Although he does come back and he plays a much older Tomney in Downtime, which is a sequel to Abominable Snowman and 17 other Doctor Who stories all at once. And Conrad, when you come back for a much later episode of Doctor Who literature, you're going to be discussing one of the 3 or 4 books that almost destroyed my fandom. Downtime, the video, is another moment that almost destroyed my fandom, but not because of James Bree. He was the best thing about it, and he's only in one scene.
And there's some great, I think this another strength of the story on TV and what Pip and Jane make of it are those actors and characters, people like James Bree and Jeffrey. Is it Jeffrey Hughes who plays Mr. Popperwick? These lovely larger than life characters that kind of bring it to life. Because the overall thing that struck me with this, and particularly is revealed in the book, is the theatricality of it. I think the combination of JNT, Colin Baker, Bonnie Langford, Robert Holmes to an extent, and Pip and Jane Baker, that is a big, fruity theatrical mix, and they really relish it. There's lots of, in the book they refer to Mel's costume at one point, and I think they add some dialogue with the Master where the Doctor thinks, the Master proclaims something, and the Doctor thinks, curtain speech or prologue to the next act? With the Master, one could never be sure. And then later, the Valiard, about to unleash his plan, says, overture and beginners, please. It's so theatrical. Grand Guignol, we never could resist a taste of the Grand Guignol, quoting Hamlet. I mean, it's just, and the classical references, as well as theatre, and of course, like Time in the Rani was named after Time in the Conways, which is very, very obscure. Like the classical references to literature, Ananias, Munchausen, Machiavelli. They mention Hobson's Choice in the book, terribly boring book I read at school. Lots of Dickens, Sidney Carton. This is sort of theatres and telly based on theatre, which is something you don't really get now. And while it is very, very overblown and very, very, we can all sort of laugh at it and stuff, I'm very fond of it, and it does make for. It's certainly very rich. It's very rich stuff. And at Christmas Day, you can sit down and eat handfuls of dried fruit, but I'd actually rather have a Christmas cake myself, full of booze that's been well steeped. And this is how I feel about this book and Pip and Jane's writing generally. Am I alone in that? Because also I was a Thatcherist. I was 15 years old in the 80s. So you think I was a teen fan who wanted teen stuff, but then I was a bit of a sort of theatrical kid, I suppose. So this was all. I loved all of this, but how do you find that stuff? Is it just too much, or is it kind of fun?
I am a frustrated actor. I did one summer at drama camp with Mariah Carey, as it turns out, in the early 1980s. I didn't find that out that she was there until years later.
Excuse me, surely, madam, this revelation should halt this trial immediately. What? You and Mariah Carey were doing plays together. What is this now?
There is a performing arts camp on Long Island called USDAN, USDAN. It's named for the beneficiaries, the donors, and it's a performing arts camp. Theater kids from all over New York come out to it. At the time, I was able to carry a tune. My mother thought I had a very good singing voice, and she thought I would benefit from going to a drama camp. So I was enrolled in a class called the Junior Chorus, and it's 2 months of singing lessons in the middle of summer with a little bit of athletics in the afternoon. At the end of the summer, the last day of camp, we put on a big stage production, which the entire camp comes together. Orchestra, scenery, etc. So the play that was put on was Annie, Get Your Gun. I auditioned for the role of Annie's little brother. Did not get it. The teacher hated me. She humiliated me in front of the entire class that summer because I had no formal singing lessons. And I didn't know about that thing where you make an O with your mouth to form a note. I had no idea that was even a thing, and I was derided at age 8 for not knowing it. I didn't find out until about 30 years later that Mariah Carey was in that group with me. There were about 80 kids, ages 8 to 11. She was one of the oldest. I would have been the youngest. And she also did not get a part in the play at the end of the summer.
See,
Go figure.
there you go. That's Showbiz Kid.
So
All I Want for Christmas is who?
my friend and colleague, Mariah Carey. So after that, I did not sing a note of music again in public for another 5 years until my bar mitzvah. So that was the end of my dramatic career. But I enjoy theatricality, and I enjoy anyone who's listened to this podcast for 3 years knows that I sometimes write sentences that I can't get my way around because they're so complex. I like that style of writing, and I have learned over the years the way actors tackle very complex Shakespearean sentences. You break it down into its component parts. And I've been working on that as I try to narrate my own scripts for this show. I agree with Conrad. I like the fruitiness of it. I like that you have all these multiple references. This is the fourth and last Pip and Jane Baker novelization to come out. So it's the last time we're going to be discussing them on Doctor Who literature. We have already covered Terror of the Vervoids. We've already covered Time in the Rani. And we've already covered The Mark of the Rani. So this is the last of their books. And I have mentioned this in other episodes. They do cram their text with these pop culture and literary references. And I love that sort of thing. I love breaking down the references. I think that their prose style is quirky because of their short, choppy sentences and dialogue that even a seasoned Shakespearean actor might have trouble getting out. But they are putting their hearts on their sleeves. They are enjoying the process of writing and layering and all these references. I would describe them as happy warriors. These are not hacks just putting out a run-of-the-mill script to get a paycheck. They are putting their souls into these stories. And if their dialogue is quote-unquote loquacious and doesn't play very well, they're trying as hard as they can. And they're far from Doctor Who's worst writers. And I think we have to give them credit for the amount of effort they put into these stories. They're really putting themselves out there.
And I think Colin Baker had a policy, didn't he, that he liked to have words in the script that kids would need to look up so that it expanded their vocabulary. And I think definitely reading a Pip and Jane Baker book as a kid, I would have been looking up quite a lot of words and learning what they meant from it. So I think it's quite good that they drop, especially in the descriptions and the adjectives. They love to the richness of the language. They bring that out, don't they?
Yeah, I learned several words on this reading that I just never. And it had me still reading from the dictionary, and also Pip and Jane also like to hide little mystery things. Some of them work, some of them don't. Like there's a bit in the trial thing where there was a sort of, they're like, how did you know the trial was fake? And on television, I think the original hook is that, oh, because you mentioned that you knew I've been charged for genocide, but you weren't even there. But there's another one that, like, haha, had you been paying attention, you'd have noticed that I never called you Melanie. And I was like, that doesn't quite, that's secondary and it doesn't make sense. But I found there was another thing that just caught my eye. They said in the book, again, expanding the backstory, they say the Time Lords, they talk about the maintenance of the Matrix, and they say the Time Lords are so lazy, they farm it out to this another alien species called the Elseviers from the moon of Leptonica or whatever. And when I saw that word Elsevier, I was just like, is that an anagram? Because Pip and Jane like their anagrams. So I was like, this is an anagram. I was like, no. And then I remembered today, I was like, no, Elsevier is an educational publishing house. So I did some digging, and basically Elsevier was a Dutch family in the 15th century who were renowned for being excellent, exquisite, meticulous printers of publishing presses. And now Elsevier is probably one of the world's biggest academic publishers of scientific and technical knowledge. And I was like, even today, just last night, 53-year-old me is just like, what's in this little tricky word? And I unpack that little thing, and Pip and Jane, even in their book, put a tiny little trick for us to find years later. And that's the sort of, that stuff that's why I still admire it today. Like one of the first notes I wrote on it, but I think it was maybe even reading the book or watching the TV, is Pip and Jane Baker are really, really fun. I just think they're so fun, and their fondness for Colin and the Sixth Doctor and Mel, the fondness is really comes across, and nobody, like Pip and Jane, like only Colin could really do Pip and Jane stuff. There's no point in them really writing for any other Doctors. That is such a good marriage that I'm so glad this happened. It shouldn't happen all the time, but I'm so glad it happened here, and that fondness and care and love really spills out into this book. So, yeah.
And speaking of writing to Colin Baker, Conrad, I heard you on another podcast a couple of months ago talking about your long and fruitful correspondence with Colin Baker. I won't ask you to repeat the whole thing here, but what podcast was that? And just give us the nutshell of that version of the story.
Yeah, very basically, I went on to the What's in the Box podcast with Jim Allenby, where you bring 4 objects about Doctor Who that you like and sort of expand what they mean to you. 2 of those things I brought that I didn't realize connected were, first, my letter writing to people, as I mentioned earlier, like with all the trial people. But I also used to write to Colin, obviously. And my second thing was a trip to the theatre where I went to see Colin Baker in a thriller called Corpse. And because I'd been writing to him quite a lot. In fact, this ties back to this story. One of the questions I asked him, I've got all his replies still, was like, how did you do the sound effect, this quick sound effect in The Ultimate Foe? And, there was lists of questions that I was going through. And he said, I haven't got time to put this now, but as you're coming to the play, why don't you come backstage afterwards and I'll explain to you how it went. And basically, long story short, I turned up there. He signed everything I ever owned, took us all on a backstage tour unexpectedly. And true to his word, he explained to me how that quick sound effect was done. So yeah, it's an episode called What's in the Box. It was a few months ago. And I sort of go on at length really about Colin and our correspondence and how much he meant to me. Yeah.
And Jim will be making his Doctor Who literature debut in about 2 or 3 weeks. So watch this space for more Jim.
Very good.
Nice.
So, Mark, bring us home then. We've heard Conrad talk about the novelization and its little Easter eggs and how it's a very interesting educational book. We've talked about Pip and Jane's dialogue and how it's not always easy to say and it's easy to make fun of, but we think there's more to it there. We've talked about the fact that they wrote this story in about 48 hours, and I have problems with the story. Most of that is the fault of the production team and not the fault of Pip and Jane Baker. They were just cleaning up several other mistakes that were not made by them. We've talked about Colin Baker. What else can we say about The Ultimate Foe? So you would have seen this in 1993. Had you read the book first, or was watching it in 1993 a complete revelation for you?
I can't remember. I'm not sure at all about that. Yeah, if it had, I think maybe the book hadn't made much impression on me, because I do think watching the story, the reveal of the Valiant and everything was a surprise and was exciting. So yeah, it could be that I'd read the book and not, probably the age I read it, it wouldn't have entertained me as much as it would when I was a bit older or now, because there's no monsters and it's not, it's not an exciting one for like an 8 or 9 year old, I guess, to read in that way, but I probably appreciate it a lot more. One thing I did draw out of it this time is that Pip and Jane Baker, I think, inspired the Master's arc in the 3rd series of New Doctor Who. When the Master gets the Sleeper's secrets from Sabalon Glitz, it says his double pulse rate pounded in his temples, which I think has got to be what inspired Russell T Davies to have the sound of drums going through the Master's head all the time. And that whole thing that it comes from when he was exposed to the untempered schism in the Sound of Drums, Last of the Time Lords two-parter. So I think the legacy of this book is still being felt decades later.
I do want to talk about Anthony Ainley for a minute. I've mentioned this many times when I'm talking about Frontier in Space. The moment in Frontier in Space where the Master shows up for the first time in Joe's prison cell, and Katie Manning cannot suppress the fact that she is delighted to see him. And for just a moment, the pretense of the story drops, and it's just Roger and Katie on set, delighted to see each other for the first time all season. And then they quickly get back into character. Her joy at seeing the Roger Delgado Master, both Katie Manning, the actress, and Joe Grant, the character, I came to realize that Anthony Ainley is criminally underrated for what he did on Doctor Who during the whole of the 1980s. I came to this appreciation when I was doing my Twitter pilgrimage in 2020 and 2021. He is terrific in Keeper of Trock, and he is not over the top. His version of the Master gets a little more comical and a little silly with time. And I think Survival is a dreadful story, and I don't think he's very well served by it. I know that's a minority opinion, but Survival is my least favorite Doctor Who ever. At least as far as the classic series goes. It's been surpassed several times in the new series. Watching Roger Delgado during the pandemic, I was thrilled every time he showed back up. So my initial reaction to seeing him in The Ultimate Foe, even though I'd already seen the story several times, even though I'd already read the book several times, I was just delighted when he pops up in the middle of Ultimate Foe. And again, the Master is being a happy warrior here. He is happily raining on everybody's parade, trying to spoil both the Doctor and the Valeyard at the same time. Anthony Ainley gives it his all every single time out, even when the script is terrible. And it's always a pleasure to have him on screen. And he gets to be the Master opposite 4 different Doctors. Who else can say that? I think we need to appreciate how good Anthony Ainley was for this series and how little credit he gets for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's the first Master I saw, so I've always really enjoyed his performance. And I enjoyed the little extra bits in this book where he talks about Mel's red hair. He says, doesn't red hair denote temper on planet Earth? And then he calls her my fiery vixen, which you can quite imagine Anthony Ainley delivering, I think.
Yeah, through a grin. I can hear him saying that. He's delicious in that. Yeah.
So this is a Doctor Who literature wrap for Pip and Jane Baker. We will not be seeing their likes again on this podcast. This is book 131. The final book in the series is 156. We have more than 25 books to go because there are a lot of interstitials coming out. We're going to be talking about the missing season 23. We're going to be talking about the Pescatons. We're going to be talking about the Paradise of Death. So we have a lot of Doctor Who to go on this show, and the podcast will probably be around for about 8 or 9 more months. But this is the last time we're going to have the opportunity to talk about Pip and Jane Baker. I think we've given them a very sound airing this week. I think we've talked about how they are much better than they are given credit for, and they're possibly made fun of for all the wrong reasons. But I think they gave it their best.
There is, and cut this out if I'm treading on your audio essay, Jason, but they do make a mistake when they says that Perry encountered Ukranos on Ravalox when it was Thoris Beta.
I did not catch that, so I will leave that out of my audio essay, and I will give you all the credit.
It's a minor point, but
very good. There is another little quibble. I love their characterization of Mel in this, who isn't very well fleshed out or well served on TV. So they put a lot in here, but there is a slight moment here I quite like. So they introduce her. As she'd been taken out of time. They said 1 minute she'd been writing an experimental program for the TARDIS computer. So I'm like, okay, good. Computer programmer. But then later they say they bring up the elephant joke again, memory like an elephant. And this time they say, she had this phenomenal capacity for total recall. odd, really, that computer programming should be her profession, since computers had virtually made memory redundant, at least where facts and figures were concerned. And they just carry on. It's almost like out loud, they're thinking, oh, now we did this program memory. And they sort of just say, they could process it out loud, this little slight glitch in her character. But, I mean, no complaints. It's lovely stuff.
The other line I think he's added for the book that isn't in the TV story is when the Master says to the Inquisitor, she says, can you prove that the Doctor and the Valeyard are the same person? And he says, I know them both intimately. Add Kenneth Williams' gif there.
Oh, please, Mark, you've got to lower the tone.
Bonnie Langford is another contributor to Doctor Who that was criminally underrated and unfairly derided. For all my complaints about the new series and RTD, I think him putting her back on the show and making her a semi-regular in 2023 and 2024 gives her a chance to do the character properly, because now she's getting to do dramatic dialogue and she's actually allowed to have something of an arc, which Pip and Jane Baker wrote her first 10 episodes, and she's only in Doctor Who for 20 weeks. The character works very well when Pip and Jane write her. She's very good. The character and the actress are very good in Terror of the Vervoid. She's given a lot of agency in that story. She's by herself a lot. She's by herself a lot in this story. Time and the Ronnie. Maybe it's not a great idea to have Kate O'Mara lampoon Bonnie Langford on camera in what is only the character's third story. And then after that, Pip and Jane Baker don't write for her again. I know the production team wanted her to stick around for half of season 25, and she opted out at the very last minute, which is why her departure scene in Dragonfire is so abrupt. I think it's a very good scene, but it is very abrupt, and it's not one of fandom's more popular companion departures. But I think Bonnie Langford, like Pip and Jane Baker, has been remembered for all the wrong reasons, much, much better than we ever gave her credit for.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Conrad, did you ever have correspondence with Bonnie Langford?
Yes, absolutely. I wrote to pretty much everybody around the 80s. So I've had some letters and photos and stuff like that. And actually last year, Pete Lambert and I went to see her doing Cabaret on the King's Road at it's a Pizza Express venue. And there's a couple of Pizza Express venues here, which sounds a bit incongruous, but they're very well-known old sort of jazz respectable sort of jazz venues, and we had front row seats, so Bonnie was literally right in front of us, and it was high kicks, splits, songs from the Numbers, talks about Doctor Who. In fact, I remember now, it was the day that The Power of the Doctor aired. That's right. And she talked about Doctor Who, and she sort of said, and you may want to watch Doctor Who later, and gave us all a great big theatrical wink. So yeah, love Bonnie.
I have not read the new novel, which has Bonnie Langford's name as author on the cover, written by Jack Rayner. I believe that may have been covered on Trap One.
It's coming up.
I looked at that book when I was in the UK. I was at Forbidden Planet in London and in Belfast and in Cardiff. And one of those three in August, I took a look at the Bonnie Langford book. I didn't buy it, but the last page of that book is an afterword by Bonnie Langford, and she mentions all of the various characters she's played on stage and screen over the years that have been embedded into that particular book as Easter eggs, including her character on Bugsy Malone when she would have been 12 years old. I don't know if it's a good book. I haven't read it, but the fact that Bonnie Langford is able to name check all of her various characters in it is really a thrilling prospect.
Yeah, that CV is just something else. When we went to see the Cabaret, she was talking about how long she's worked in theatre, and people and basically she was trying to recount all these stories, and she goes, to be honest, there's so much of it. What I've done is I've printed out my Wikipedia article, which she didn't read. She sang it, and she turned the song Memory from Cats, and she sang her whole Wikipedia through the song of Memory by Andrew Lloyd Webber, and talking about losing her memory. It was there you go. A life in theatre and song is. If you just want a good time, just go and look at Bonnie Langford's Wikipedia. Look at all those theatrical credits and just marvel. It's amazing.
That is a 50-year career where she has never stopped working.
Love you, Bon.
So we are coming to the end of our hour on the Ultimate Foe. So ultimately, where can we find you fine gentlemen online? And I expect Trap One Podcast is a large part of both of your answers.
Yes, you can find me regularly on the Trap One podcast, and I'll be on the new series of Maximum Power, the new and final series of Maximum Power that'll be starting at the end of the year, where we look at Series D.
That's Series D, the last of the 4 series.
That's it. About halfway through recording it.
And you can also find Mark on a very good episode of Size Impossible, the Library of Impossible Things, that's just out, which I listened to and is excellent. We were just discussing it before the podcast, and some very interesting things about when Mark met John Pertwee. He's too young. How could this have happened? Find out. Yeah, you can find me on. I'm still hanging in on Twitter and also Blue Sky, Hair of the Hound, and I'm going to be on a Trap One coming out next month in December, which is all about. So, Jason, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mentioned Paul Scoons earlier. Your review of the Return of the Daleks Backstrips comic collection. We did a review of that on Trap One, and we're doing Volume 2 next month. And I like to make that it's a Trap One winter special, so it'll be full of goodies. We've got some amazing guests. It's going to be a monster winter humdinger. So listen out for that.
My podcast backlog is about 7 weeks long. So as we are sitting here on Election Day in the States, I am listening to podcasts that drop the week of the 11th of September. So I just listened to Conrad moderating the Return of the Daleks Trap One bumper episode a couple of days ago, and I did email Conrad about how much I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I bought Return of the Daleks in August, but I didn't get a chance to read it until last month. So I'm glad I saved that episode until after I'd had a chance to read it and talk to Paul about it.
It's a brilliant episode.
And of course, Conrad, you've been on What's on the Box recently, which I have listened to, and Jim will be on this show in a couple of weeks. Anywhere else that we can find you?
I think the only thing... Actually, you know what? I should give this a plug. I never do this. There's a big finish out this month that's got my face in the front, so I must be in it. It's Time War Uncharted Reflections, where I had a whale of a time being really horrible to Paul McGann. God, I enjoyed that. So that's out. And also, I'm going to be on Maximum Power as well, Series D. I've recorded one of those. So I think that'll be coming. I think they're starting it towards the end of this year. So my episode will be out in January. But yeah, listen to Maximum Power as well.
I'll just say that Reflections is excellent as well, the Big Finish box set. I've listened to that, and it's brilliant. Yeah.
I pushed a giant treasure chest full of unconvincing gold and goodies towards Mark so that he would say that. Thanks.
Slightly related to this book, there's an explanation in this book of how the Master and the Rani escaped from the T-Rex at the end of Mark of the Rani, which I was previously unaware of. I must have read the book and not remembered it. But they explain that as the T-Rex continued to grow, it snapped its neck because it got too big for the TARDIS control room. So having not remembered that, a few years ago I was invited to write a short story for a charity anthology called Masterpieces. And the idea that I came up with was what happened immediately after the Mark of the Rani and how the Master and the Rani escaped from that. That book was available from Amazon for a while. I'm not sure if it still is, but if it's still about there anyway, it's called Masterpieces. And it's got a lot of other better writers than me in it, but it covers all the different incarnations of the Master. And I did the Anthony Ainley one. So if you can find it, or if there's an ebook maybe, it was for a good cause. And some cool stories in there.
And for myself, I have been on Trap One a couple of times recently. I was on the Evil of the Daleks episode with Mark and Pete, which just dropped, I should say, not Conrad. And I will be on the Trap One coming up in a few weeks for The Adventures Before, which is a series of short story prequels to the greatest Doctor Who episodes of all time, and Ark of Infinity, and Planet of the Dead.
And your episode on the Crusade was excellent as well. I really enjoyed that one.
Yes, that was with Gary Gillett and
Jeff Goddard.
Jeff has become a great friend. I met him through Trap One. He and I had not worked together before until this year, but now we've worked together several times. He's a gentleman and a scholar, as the expression goes.
Absolutely adore Jeff. He's also on our back. I also got him for our Backstrips review as well. So yeah, more Jeff.
Yeah, he's great.
Yes, all voices that I hope to feature on Doctor Who literature in the last few months of this show. After the break, Jason takes on Pip and Jane's loquacious writing style in my audio essay about Doctor Who, The Ultimate Foe. Doctor Who, The Trial of a Time Lord, The Ultimate Foe, written by Pip and Jane Baker, televised as The Trial of a Time Lord, parts 13 and 14, part 13 teleplay by Robert Holmes and Eric Sayward, screen credit to Robert Holmes, part 14 teleplay by Pip and Jane Baker, following a withdrawn script from Eric Sayward, based possibly on a fragment of a conversation he might have had with Robert Holmes much earlier. Screen credit to Pip and Jane Baker. Got that? There'll be a quiz later. Televised in November and December 1986. Paperback release date September 15th, 1988. Target book number 131. Cover artist Alister Pearson. Snatched out of time and place and brought before the Time Lords of Gallifrey, the Doctor is on trial for his life. Yes, it says place, not space. While the Doctor asserts that the evidence of the Matrix, the repository of all Time Lord knowledge, has been tampered with, the mysterious and vengeful prosecuting counsel, the Valeyard, is confident that the Doctor will be sentenced to death. In a dramatic intervention, the Valeyard's true identity is revealed, but he escapes from the courtroom into the Matrix, and it is into this nightmare world that the Doctor must follow to face his ultimate foe. This is what happens when Doctor Who doesn't have a plan. Incredibly, the 14-part episode, The Trial of a Time Lord, was conceived without a definite ending. You can't make this stuff up. When Robert Holmes died after scripting most of Part 13, nobody knew, apart from a vague over-reliance on Sherlock Holmes' The Final Problem, how Part 14 was going to wrap up. Now you know who had a plan? Chris Chibnall. I coincidentally watched The Ultimate Foe during a pre-pandemic rewatch of the Colin Baker era, only a few days prior to the airing of The Timeless Children. The Doctor and the Master mind wrestling in the Matrix? A previously unknown incarnation of the Doctor showing up to send continuity into a tailspin? Time Lords and high collars? They're basically the same thing, except that Chibnall knew what he was doing. Well, in the sense that he had the whole season planned out before the cameras started to roll. Ultimate Foe, while very good in spots, is derailed by four things. Robert Holmes dying before finishing, Eric Sayward quitting when JNT nixed his idea to end the season, as Holmes is said to have wanted, with a Reichenbach Falls moment, Pip and Jane Baker's dialogue choices in Part 14, we discussed that earlier, and Chris Clough's direction. The first half of Part 13 is all the remaining Holmes stuff, mostly set in the courtroom, and it is excellent. Well, excepting that Bob Holmes seems to have had no idea what to do with one Benita Langford.
If I might intercede...
You have no part in these proceedings, sir.
Corporeally, of course not, but I'm present and enjoying myself enormously.
Doctor, please examine your witnesses.
Yes, madam.
This is real maconite, you know. Worth a few grotsits today, Your Honour.
Glitz.
I could make you a fair offer on a job lot. Do
Glitz.
you a very good deal. What?
You were sent here by the master.
Yeah, well, he's a business partner, so to speak. We've had a few nice little tickles
This
together.
court is not interested in your sordid business deals, Glitz.
Very good, Doctor. Keep him to the point.
When we last met, you expressed interest in a box.
Right.
What was in that box?
Well, I don't know. Scientific stuff, so he said. Stuff the sleepers had been nicking from the Matrix for years.
The Matrix? My Matrix?
Right. Well, it seems the sleepers had found a way to break into the Matrix, and they were creaming off all this high-tech info to take back to Andromeda.
But they were operating from Earth.
Of course! That was their cover, wasn't it? They knew that the Time Lords eventually would trace the leak.
He's lying, my lady.
I don't think so, Stackyard. It all begins to make very good sense.
That's it, Doc. Now we're getting at the dirt.
Doc?
This is how the trial season should have wrapped up. opines this one jurist, with an actual trial, not with a Matrix rehash of the deadly assassin, or prehash of the timeless children. The dialogue is crisp. The Master's arrival is a pleasant surprise. Anthony Ainley finally reaching the point, a la Roger Delgado, where you're glad to see him show up. Then who better to bring him back than his own creator, or co-creator, Robert Holmes. James Bree, one of my favorite Doctor Who guest actors, gets to deliver dialogue crisply, except sadly, as we observed earlier, there's hardly any of it. But Chris Clough can fairly be said to have botched the good stuff. The Doctor's incandescent rage at the reveal of the High Council's treachery.
Carry on, Glitz. What happened next?
Well, eventually the Time Lords did suss out the leak. So they wanted to wipe out all the sleepers. And they used this
Magnetron?
That's it.
Oh, that can only be done by an order in High Council.
Of course, Doctor. To protect their own secrets, they drew the Earth and its constellation billions of miles across space.
Causing the fireball which nearly destroyed the planet.
Of little consequence in the High Council's planning. The robot recovery mission from Andromeda sped past Earth, out into space. Gallifreyan secrets were saved, except that at the first intimation of the coming fireball, the Andromedans were able to set up a survival chamber for the sleepers.
So that's why Earth was renamed Ravalox. That sanctimonious gang of hypocrites were covering their tracks.
Exactly. It takes time, Doctor, but eventually you get there.
They put an ancient culture like the Earth to the sword for the sake of a few miserable, filthy scientific advances.
Big market for them, Doctor. So he said. Worth a lot of grotzits.
In all my travellings throughout the universe, I have battled against evil. Against power-mad conspirators. I should have stayed here. The oldest civilization. Decadent, degenerate, and rotten to the core. Power-mad conspirators, Daleks, Sontarans, Cybermen. They're still in the nursery compared to us. 10 million years of absolute power. That's what it takes to be really corrupt.
Well, this is mostly visualized on screen by a master shot, not as an Anthony Ainley. From the back of the courtroom, as Colin Baker is emoting in literally one of his final days as the Doctor, Clough shoots the very unemotive back of Colin Baker's head. Later, when the Master, not the Master shot, reveals that Perry is still alive, no matter what we saw in Mind Warp, Clough again shoots from the back of the room. No close-ups, no emoting. Never mind Article 7 of Gallifreyan law. This is the real crime. Chris Clough's direction. Once the location shifts into the Matrix midway through Part 13, the story loses just about all of its momentum. We've seen it before, and would see it again, but the Fantasy Factory stuff, and the two Mr. Popplewicks, and the ludicrous Part 13 cliffhanger are all of little interest or momentum, at least to me. Mel and James Bree disappear from the story for what seems like years at a time. Now we finally get to see Linda Bellingham not sitting as she'd done for the entirety of the first 12 episodes, i.e. 3 months of television time. But even then the script casts her into the role of spectator, and watching the great Ainley portrayed mostly in long shot on a tiny viewer screen, watching this thing back in 1986 on a 19-inch color television set, he must have appeared to have been the size of a lima bean as shot from the Hubble telescope, also doesn't do much to engage the viewer. Now Part 14, that's the one written by Pip and Jane, who did the novelization, has some interesting moments, and at over 29 minutes stands as a 4-minute overrun compared to Doctor Who's usual length at the time. But again, Part 14 doesn't quite hold up. It's a trial that ends without a trial. The Inquisitor has nothing to do in Part 14, and the Bakers, again coming in the way they did on zero notice, did not really have a chance to give James Bree anything to do. The Valeyard's villainy involves him being tied to a rail, and even though he unties himself, continues to stand benignly against the rail, while the Doctor reverses the polarity of his killer death rays and seems to go up in smoke. Now, again, these are critiques, not criticisms. This is not bashing. The special effects are good. The limbo atrophy effect in the Master's TARDIS looks cool, as does that final Fantasy Factory explosion. But then the Doctor, who chronologically has not met Mel yet, all this takes place before Terror of the Vervoids in the Doctor's own timeline, departs with her in the TARDIS, setting off a time paradox that, to their credit, the novelization will fix. And then it turns out the Valeyard is alive after all, inexplicably wearing James Bree's costume. Holmes and Sayward had wanted to end the season on a full cliffhanger, or so it's been said, but instead here the TARDIS departs, just assuming the bad guy is dead, and then the bad guy turns and cackles to the camera, cue and credits, and we never see that bad guy again, except at convention appearances. And the sixth Doctor's final words, well, the less said about those, the better.
Right, a bracing glass of carrot juice.
Carrot juice?
And then we'll get you back on the exerciser.
You know, I think I was rash in turning down that offer of the presidency. Oh, carrot juice. Carrot juice, carrot juice, carrot juice.
So, that got out of control in a hurry. Can't really blame Pip and Jane Baker for any of this. They did the best they could in a script written on less than a week's notice, but their brainstorming could reasonably have begun with, we're being asked to write about the trial of a Time Lord, and there's precious little trial in The Ultimate Foe, especially in Part 14, precious little logic, precious little James Bree, even though the final installment is 5 minutes longer than any other Doctor Who story of its ilk outside of Season 22. In terms of the book, as Mark and Conrad and I discussed earlier, this is the last appearance of Pip and Jane in Doctor Who literature, at least for those of you listening in publication rather than story order. Conrad, in fact, basically reviewed the book already over the previous hour, and if I was more enterprising, or if I didn't have a weekly schedule and had more time to edit each episode, I would have ditched this essay. This is based on drafts that I composed for the Doctor Who Ratings Guide in March 2020, before COVID got me, in which I never ended up publishing, and I would have re-edited Conrad's statements in the previous hour into the review for this week. So, we will not be commenting on Pip and Jane Baker's odd vocabulary choices, or overuse of ellipses, ... and the other uniquely Pip and Janeian narrative choices. I did that for their other 3 novelizations, and that ground need not be re-explored. You can take all my old episodes as read. All of that Pip and Jane stuff happens in this book too. I will say it's the second straight book of theirs, in story order, tying in with Terror of the Vervoids, to liken one of its characters to Uriah Heep, which tells you what the Bakers were reading in the mid-80s, a lot of David Copperfield, and the phrase Judas Goat appears in the second straight book, again in story order. But once again, these are observations, these are not true complaints. For Ultimate Foe, the Bakers had a mighty task set before them, rescue a failing episode whose first author died before finishing, whose second author resigned and took his scripts with him. The novelization is the Bakers' best chance to unify the story and make sense of the Ultimate Foe's opaque conclusion. They succeed, pretty much. These short chapters help, as the series of mini cliffhangers helps sort the plot into its many constituent components. The Master shows up at the end of Chapter 2, though the Bakers oddly don't name him as such. The revelation of the Valeyard's identity is held for the end of Chapter 4, though I coincidentally began reading this book for my failed March 2020 review attempt the day after The Timeless Children aired, and clearly it was Chris Chibnall's intent to nullify some of these revelations. Thanks to Chris, now part of the show's canon, in a way it was not in 1986, the Doctor no longer has a, quote, penultimate reincarnation. The Doctor's incandescent rage, in his speech about the evils of the High Council, the audio for which I played a few minutes ago, is nice to read, although these are presumably the author's original words, and not quite as quotable as when Colin Baker delivered a subtly altered version in the sets at Television Center. Nobody in print points out the plot hole of the Valeyard presenting the Ravelox segment as evidence when it was the biggest indicator of guilt in his whole gosh darned scheme. The one cliffhanger, part 13, comes very early in the book, at the end of chapter 9, well before the halfway page count. This does allow Pip and Jane to spend more of the book adapting their half of the script, as opposed to the late Robert Holmes's quarter, the trial stuff, and the Eric Sayward quarter, the part 13 Matrix stuff. Now that's fine, but they never really do explain the resolution to that part 13 cliffhanger. They do clearly enjoy making Glitz the Doctor's temporary companion, with lines like, "If this was the way honest people carried on, thank goodness for crime." Similarly, Chapter 15, devoted to the mutual mistrust between Glitz and his temporary ally the Master, as conveyed by internal thought processes, is quite funny. Conrad earlier points out the delicious in-joke as to how the Master acquired access to the Matrix. I was this week's years old when I realized the Elsevier connection, but the Bakers perhaps obscure the point by using nonsense words like thyrostatic kinosectoral energy, I may have pronounced that wrong, to describe the powers of the Matrix, which is far less helpful than the authors probably thought. Better is the explanation of how the Master and the Rani survived the end of their previous story in television order, The Mark of the Rani. The pacing is not helped by phrasing like this in Chapter 20. Quote, "The officious kowtowing of the spurious clerk had regressed to the conniving prosecutor's abrasive condescension." Yes, I know Conrad said that already, and I can't say it nearly as well as he can, but I had to try. Such prose doesn't do much to blunt the similar TV dialogue. You know what I mean. Otherwise, nothing you can do will prevent the catharsis of megabyte modems. I know I said I wouldn't harp on the prose, but I lied. Spurious morality and all that. The Bakers leave out last-minute J&T scripted dialogue about the Doctor learning of Peri's rescue from Thoros Beta, but they do add a necessary epilogue to relieve the time paradox of the Doctor leaving a Mel whom, chronological speaking, he had not yet met, and a direct lead-in to the author's own time and the Rani. We will wrap up this audio essay by turning the floor back over to Conrad, who has a reading for us. Thank you in advance, Conrad. Can't wait to hear what you've done for us this week.
Doctor Who, The Ultimate Foe, Epilogue by Pip and Jane Baker. Mel wasn't laughing. The Doctor had just told her they must part. "You're from my future, Mel. You can't stay with me now." "So what happens?" "For a start, I don't have to drink carrot juice." "No, seriously. You were taken out of time for the purposes of the trial. Now you've got to be returned." "Well, can't you work a fiddle or something? Change time and let me stay?" "Change, Mel. Haven't I just been tried for meddling?" I know. "When? When what? Am I to be taken back?" "Look at the console." Not a flicker of movement. The Doctor had followed all the recognised procedures, but, except for dematerialising the TARDIS, the sophisticated mechanism was non-operative. We have to be placed in the exact situations we were in before we were hijacked, so to speak. Neither you nor I have any choice, Mel. Despite the quiescent interior controls, the TARDIS was moving. The beam of light that had abducted the police box and wafted it to the space station housing the courtroom was now propelling it towards a destination that lay in the Doctor's future. Mel had to be restored to Oxyvigura Mosa, a verdant stellar fragment in the Apus constellation. Only then could the Doctor be returned to the position in time from which he was snatched. He wondered whether to attempt an explanation of the chronology to Mel. "I'd better not," he muttered. "What?" inquired Mel. "Oh, nothing. Just thinking aloud." Before she could nail this evasion, the TARDIS jolted to a halt. "Au revoir, Mel," he said teasingly. She hesitated, reluctant to leave him. "Go on." He empathised with her qualms. "You'll be with me again. Quicker than you imagine." Who knows? Maybe a slimline version. Mel exited. She turned back and blinked. 2 TARDISes in the shape of a blue police box were standing side by side. Before she could collect her senses, one of them dematerialized. Tentatively, she entered the remaining time machine. Mel, you promised you'd have this program completed! The Doctor was tinkering with the computer. What's more, he had shed several centimetres from his girth. Cat got your tongue, he grumbled. Don't you want to resume our fascinating travels? Well, that depends. On what? How much you've confused the situation, she peered at the VDU. Move over. Not offended, he grinned. Having this dynamic redhead as a companion was a prospect he viewed with unqualified pleasure. But that pleasure was to be tempered by a hazardous journey into uncharted territory. Hazards that were destined to have a profound impact on the 6th Doctor. For he was about to embark on a series of adventures that would eventually culminate in a confrontation with Irani, after which this Doctor would never be the same again.
Next time on Doctor Who Literature, we are going back to the beginning, to one of the last, in fact the last, Season 1, 1963-64 television serial that has not yet been novelized. That is, Doctor Who, The Edge of Destruction, teleplay by David Whittaker, novelization by guest of Doctor Who Literature, Nigel Robinson. Nigel will not be back next week. I do plan on having a first-time guest who will help me break down The Edge of Destruction. Now there is Planet of Giants yet to come. That was produced as part of Season 1, but was held back to double as the Season 2 premiere. As it stands, The Edge of Destruction is the oldest Doctor Who serial from the last several years of the target range. And that will be next week on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. Each episode is produced by Jim Sangster and yours truly. This week's episode was written and edited by me. Our logo was designed and our YouTube channel is run by Jim Sangster. Special thanks to my special guests, Mark and Conrad, both from Trap One Podcast. This podcast can be found on your podcast app of choice, with all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/Doctor Who Lit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. Even at this late date, it's never too late to leave me a review. You can find me on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who Podcast Network.